Hey guys, tonight we are spending some time with 4 people who made one final phone call, sent one last text, left one last voicemail, and then disappeared. And I want to be upfront with you about something before we begin. These are not stories I take lightly. Every person we are going to talk about tonight was someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's parent, and the families who were on the other end of those last calls are still living with the silence that followed. Before you settle in, if you would, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. Thank you so much to everyone who has been following along and sharing these stories. It matters more than you know. Now, get comfortable. Maybe turn the lights down a little. If you are listening to this late at night, that is all right. You are in good company. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. Someone out there is always listening at 2 a.m, scrolling through their phone, wondering about the people who sent their last message and never got a reply. Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked at your phone after missing a call from someone you love and thought, I will just call them back later? Have you ever read a text and figured you would respond in the morning? Have you ever been mid-conversation with someone, heard the line cut out and just assumed the signal dropped? We all have. Every single one of us has had a moment like that. And for almost everyone, the call reconnects, the text gets answered, the person comes home. But tonight, we are going to talk about the times when that did not happen, when the phone went quiet and the person on the other end was simply gone. Not in an hour, not the next day, not ever. This is the last signal, and these are their stories. Before we get into the first case, I want to talk about phones for a moment, about what they mean to us and what we expect from them. Because our relationship with our phones has changed so dramatically over the past 20 years that the very concept of being unreachable has become almost foreign. Think about how you use your phone right now. It is probably within arm's reach as you listen to this. Maybe it is in your hand. Maybe it is on the nightstand beside your bed. You can call anyone in the world. You can text them. You can share your location with a single tap. If you are in trouble, you press 3 numbers and help is supposed to come. But the 4 people we are going to talk about tonight lived in a time or were in a place where that promise broke down. In 2008, when Brandon Swanson disappeared, smartphones with GPS were not yet standard. He had a basic flip phone. He could call, but he could not show his parents where he was on a map. In 2004, when Maura crashed her car, there was no cell service at all on the stretch of road where she went off the pavement. She was standing next to a telephone in her pocket that could not reach anyone. In 2013, when Brandon Lawson called 911, the call was routed to a nursing home because there was no dedicated dispatcher for that rural area. And in 2010, when Tuccaro got into a stranger's car, the only reason we have a recording of her last moments is that her brother happened to call her from a jail that recorded outgoing calls. In each case, the technology worked just enough to create a record, but not enough to save a life. The phone connected the voice, but could not bridge the distance. The signal was there, but the rescue was not. And the families were left with the worst possible combination of information and helplessness. They heard their loved one. They heard the fear or the confusion or the love, and they could do nothing. That is the world we are entering tonight. A world where the phone rings, but the help does not come. Where the signal is strong, but the darkness is stronger. There is a particular kind of horror that lives inside a phone call that ends wrong, not a phone that rings and rings with no answer, though that is its own quiet agony, not a voicemail that never gets returned, though that carries its own weight. The kind I am talking about is worse. It is the phone call where you're speaking to someone, hearing their voice, sharing a conversation, and then the line goes dead in a way that tells you something is very, very wrong. Think about that for a moment. You are in your living room. It is late. Your son has called you because his car is stuck in a ditch somewhere out on a dark road, and you are talking him through it, trying to figure out where he is, trying to keep him calm while you drive out to find him. You have been on the phone with him for almost 50 minutes, and then, mid-sentence, he says 2 words that make your blood go cold, and then silence. You call back again, and the phone just rings. Your son is 19 years old, and he is standing somewhere in the darkness of rural Minnesota, and you do not know where he is, and he is not picking up. Or imagine this. You are a police officer pulling up to a car crash on a frozen New Hampshire road in February. The car is crumpled into a snowbank. There is a spider web of cracks across the windshield. A local man tells you he just spoke to the driver, a young woman, and she seemed shaken, but alert. She told him she had already called for a tow. But by the time you walk up to the car, no more than 7 or 8 minutes after the crash, the young woman is gone. Her car is locked. A rag is stuffed into the tailpipe. There's a box of wine on the back seat, spilled, and there are no footprints leading away in the snow. There's no cell phone signal out here. She could not have called anyone, and nobody saw her leave. Or picture yourself as a brother, sitting in a jail cell in Edmonton, Canada, and you get a phone call from your 20-year-old sister. She is in a car with a man you do not know. She sounds uneasy. She says to him loud enough that you can hear it through the line that he had better not be taking her anywhere she does not want to go. And then the call ends. You try to call her back, but you are in a jail. You cannot just pick up the phone whenever you want, and your sister, who is a mother to a 14-month-old baby boy, does not call again. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not ever. These are the kinds of phone calls we are going to sit with tonight. Not because they are exciting, not because they make for a good mystery, but because the people who lived through them, on both ends of the line, deserve to have their stories told properly, with care, with accuracy, and with the understanding that somewhere, right now, a mother is still leaving her porch light on. A father is still driving those back roads. A sister is still recording a podcast because she refuses to let the world forget her sibling's name. Tonight we are going to talk about 4 cases. 4 people who reached out through their phones in what would turn out to be their final moments of contact with the people who loved them. Brandon Swanson, a 19-year-old college student in Minnesota. Maura Murray, a 21-year-old nursing student in Massachusetts. Brandon Lawson, a 26-year-old father of 4 in Texas. And Amber Tuccaro, a 20-year-old Indigenous mother in Alberta, Canada. Each of them made a call. Each of them was heard. And each of them vanished into a silence that has never been fully explained. We take for granted, most of us, that communication means safety. That if I can hear you, I can help you. That if you can call me, you are reachable. But the physics of the situation are more fragile than we like to believe. A phone signal is just radio waves bouncing between a device in your hand and a tower that might be 20 miles away. It does not know where you are in any human sense. It does not know you are lost. It does not know you are afraid. It does not know the river is close and the bank is steep and the ground is wet. All it knows is that there is a signal, and that signal can carry your voice to the person who loves you most. And that person can hear every word you say and still be powerless to save you. That is the cruelty at the center of every story we are about to explore. There is a particular quality to a phone call that makes it different from any other form of communication. It is immediate. It is intimate. When you are on the phone with someone, you can hear them breathing. You can hear the ambient sounds around them, the wind, the traffic, the creak of a floorboard. You can hear the quality of their voice, whether it is tight with stress or loose with laughter or flat with exhaustion. You are hearing a person in real time, and that creates a kind of closeness that a text message or an email cannot replicate. But a phone call also carries a lie inside it. The lie is that presence equals proximity. When you hear someone's voice, your brain registers them as near. You feel like they are with you, right there, in the room. And they are not. They might be 10 miles away. They might be in a different state. They might be standing in a field in the dark, in the middle of nowhere. And you would not know it from the sound of their voice. That illusion of proximity is what makes these stories so painful. The families on the other end of these calls felt close to the people they loved. They could hear them. They were talking to them. And yet the physical distance between them was vast. And the information they needed to close that distance, the simple answer to the question, "Where are you?" was either unavailable or wrong. There is a word for this kind of experience in psychology. It is called ambiguous loss, a concept developed by a therapist named Pauline Boss. It describes the kind of grief that comes when someone you love is gone, but not confirmed dead, when there is no body, no funeral, no final answer. The families in tonight's stories have lived inside that ambiguity for years, in some cases for decades. They know the last words, they heard the last sound, but they do not know what happened next. And that not knowing is its own kind of wound that does not close. Let us start where the phone rang first. To understand what happened to Brandon Swanson, you have to understand the part of Minnesota he lived in. Marshall is a small city in the southwest corner of the state. It sits out on the prairie, surrounded by farmland that stretches flat to the horizon in every direction. The towns out here are tiny: Lind, Taunton, Porter. Some of them are barely more than a cluster of houses, a church, maybe a grain elevator rising against the sky. The roads between them are gravel and blacktop, ruler straight. And at night, they are dark in a way that is hard to imagine if you have grown up in a place with streetlights. There are no streetlights out here, just the occasional yard light from a farmstead and the stars overhead, if the sky is clear enough to see them. Picture yourself standing on one of these roads at 2 in the morning in mid-May. The temperature is somewhere around 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The air has that particular late spring chill, the kind that gets into your bones when you are not dressed for it. The wind is steady and unbroken because there's nothing to break it. No buildings, no trees, just the flat open land and the sky. You can see the glow of a town somewhere in the distance, maybe a few miles off, maybe more. It is hard to judge distances out here. The lights sit on the horizon like low stars, and they all look the same. This is the world Brandon Swanson was standing in when he called his parents. Brandon Victor Swanson was 19 years old. He had been born on January 30th, 1989, and he lived with his parents, Brian and Annette, in Marshall. By all accounts, he was a responsible young man. He stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed about 120 pounds, wore glasses, and had recently completed a 1-year wind energy program at Minnesota West Community and Technical College on the Canby campus. Canby is a small town about 30 miles northwest of Marshall. That 30-mile commute was just a fact of life for students like Brandon, who lived in the region and drove between home and campus along rural highways. His friends described him as bright and outgoing. He was the kind of person who looked forward to things. He was not the kind of person who would vanish on purpose. That matters, not because it tells us what happened, but because it tells us who we are talking about. A young man with a plan and a family and a life that he was building. May 13, 2008, was the last day of classes for the spring semester. Brandon stayed in Canby that evening to celebrate with friends. He went to a couple of small gatherings. People who were there said he had been drinking, but nobody felt he was heavily intoxicated. He was in good spirits. The school year was done. He was looking ahead. Sometime before midnight, Brandon got in his green Chevrolet Lumina and started the drive home to Marshall. The route would have taken him southeast along State Highway 68, a 2-lane road that cuts through open farmland. The temperature that night was dropping steadily. The fields were dark, the road was quiet, and somewhere along the way, something went wrong. Just before 2 in the morning on May 14th, Brandon called his parents. He told them he had driven off the road and into a ditch. The car was not badly damaged and he was not hurt, but the tires could not get enough traction to pull the vehicle back onto the pavement. He needed them to come pick him up. He said he thought he was near the town of Lind, which sits about 7 miles southwest of Marshall. Brian and Annette got out of bed, climbed into their pickup truck, and started driving. Now think about this from Brian and Annette's perspective. It is the middle of the night. Your son has just called, and he is stuck on the road somewhere. But he is fine. He is talking to you. He sounds a little frustrated, maybe a little embarrassed, but he is okay. This is the kind of thing that happens to 19-year-olds. You're going to drive out there, pick him up, and bring him home. You might give him a hard time about it in the morning. That is all this is. They kept Brandon on the phone. The plan was simple. They would talk to each other, narrow down his location, and find him. Brandon agreed to stay with his car and flash his headlights so they could spot him. But something was wrong, almost from the beginning. Brian and Annette drove to the area near Lind where Brandon said he was, and they started flashing their headlights. Brandon, from wherever he was, flashed his lights too, but neither of them could see the other. Brian would say, "I am flashing my lights now. Do you see me?" And Brandon would say no. Brandon would say, "I am flashing mine. Can you see me?" And Brian would say, "No." This is the part that is so difficult to sit with. 2 sets of headlights flashing in the darkness of southwestern Minnesota. A father and mother in one place, a son in another. Both certain they are close, both wrong. This went on for some time. The frustration was mounting. At one point, Annette actually hung up the phone in exasperation, though she immediately called back and apologized to Brandon. It was late. Everyone was tired and confused. The darkness was total, and nothing was lining up. What nobody knew at the time, and what would only become clear later, was that Brandon was not near Lind at all. He was not even close. Cell phone records would eventually show that Brandon's calls were pinging off a tower near the town of Taunton, which is along State Highway 68, the main route between Canby and Marshall. Taunton is roughly 25 miles from Lind. 25 miles. Brandon had somehow become deeply disoriented about where he was. The gravel roads out there look alike in the daylight. At night, with no landmarks visible and no GPS on his phone, it would have been remarkably easy to lose track of which road you were on, which turn you had taken, which set of distant lights belonged to which town. This is 2008. Smartphones with GPS mapping were not yet standard. Brandon had a basic cell phone. It could make calls, but it could not show him a map of where he was standing. He was navigating by memory and by the dim glow of towns he thought he recognized. And he was wrong by 25 miles. Eventually, Brandon told his parents he was going to start walking. He said he could see lights in the distance that he believed were the town of Lind. He told them to meet him there. Brian dropped Annette off at home and headed back out. He and Brandon agreed to try to rendezvous at the parking lot of a bar in Lind. They stayed on the phone while Brandon walked. Brian was driving. Brandon was describing what he was passing. Fences. He mentioned fences. He could hear water nearby, running water, which would later become a significant detail. The terrain was uneven. He kept walking toward the lights. Imagine being Brian in this moment. You are driving in the dark. Your son is walking somewhere, and you can hear his footsteps and his breathing and the wind in the phone. He is describing things you cannot see. You are looking for him, and he is looking for you, and you are both out in the Minnesota night, and neither of you can find the other. 47 minutes into the call, something happened. Brandon had been talking mid-sentence when he suddenly broke off and said 2 words. "Oh shit." And then the phone went quiet. Not dead. Quiet. There was no scream, no sound of a struggle, no sound of a fall or a splash, just sudden, absolute silence. Brian waited on the line, listening. He called Brandon's name. Nothing. Then he hung up and called back. Brandon did not answer. He called again. No answer. He called again and again and again through the rest of the night. The phone rang every time. It did not go straight to voicemail. It rang and rang and rang, which meant it was still powered on, still receiving a signal. But Brandon never picked up. Think about that phone ringing, not going to voicemail, ringing. Somewhere in a field in southwestern Minnesota, a phone is ringing in the dark, and nobody is answering it. At 6:30 in the morning, Brian and Annette called the police in Lind and reported their son missing. The response they received is something the Swanson family has spoken about publicly for years. They were told, essentially, that it was not unusual for a young man Brandon's age to stay out all night after the last day of college classes. Annette specifically recalled that one of the officers told them it was Brandon's right to be missing, his right to be missing, a phrase that has haunted this family ever since. The Lynn police did eventually begin a search, but they found nothing in or around the town. This is when things became more complicated. When the Lyon County Sheriff's Office obtained Brandon's cell phone records, they discovered that his calls had not been coming from near Lind at all. He had been calling from the vicinity of Taunton and Porter, 25 miles to the northwest. His car was eventually found in a ditch near the intersection of State Highway 68 and a county road northeast of Porter. It had been there the whole time, 25 miles from where everyone was looking. The search shifted. Investigators brought in search dogs, and the dogs led authorities to the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, which runs through the area near where Brandon's car was found. At the time of his disappearance, The river was high and flowing fast from spring runoff. In some areas, the water was as deep as 10 to 15 feet. The initial theory was that Brandon may have accidentally walked into the river in the darkness and drowned. The mention of water that Brandon made to his father, that he could hear water nearby, supported this possibility. But that theory raised its own problems. If Brandon had fallen into the river, his body should have been carried downstream and eventually recovered. Extensive searches of the river and its banks turned up nothing. Search dogs were brought in from multiple states. Volunteers walked the fields and farmland surrounding the area. Horses and ATVs were used to cover the rougher terrain. Boats from the State Department of Natural Resources were deployed on the water. Gates were installed along the river to catch anything that might float past. Sheriff Wayne Vizecki walked 2 miles of the Yellow Medicine River every single day for 30 consecutive days after the disappearance, every single day for a month, walking the same stretch of river looking for any sign of a boy who said, "Oh, shit," and disappeared. Nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single physical trace of Brandon Swanson has ever been found. Over 500 volunteers spent more than 120 days searching over 100 square miles. 30 dog handlers from 9 different states participated. One of the search coordinators said something that has stayed with me. He said, "Imagine putting a softball in an area of 144 square miles and being told to find it. That is what searching for Brandon was like." And then there was the question of his phone. After Brandon disappeared, his phone continued to ring when called. It did not go directly to voicemail, which is what typically happens when a cell phone is submerged in water or its battery has died. The phone appeared to be on and functional for approximately 2 days after his disappearance. 2 days of ringing. 2 days of Brian and Annette calling their son's phone and hearing it ring and hoping with every ring that he would pick up. This detail has puzzled investigators and family members for years. If Brandon fell into the river, where was his phone? If it landed on dry ground after he dropped it, why was it never found? One possibility is that Brandon dropped the phone at the moment of his exclamation, and it landed on dry ground near the riverbank. Another is that the phone was somewhere else entirely, in a location that does not match the drowning theory. The phone itself has never been recovered. Some have theorized that Brandon may have sought shelter in a farm outbuilding and died there from exposure or an injury, his body hidden inside a structure that was never searched. Others have wondered about the possibility of foul play, though no evidence of that has ever been found either. A psychological analysis of the case, using what is sometimes called an equivocal missing person analysis, considered every possibility from voluntary disappearance to accidental death to homicide. The conclusion was that accidental death, most likely by drowning or exposure, was the most probable scenario. But the absence of any physical evidence has kept the case open and the family searching. The impact of Brandon's disappearance extended beyond his family. The delay in the initial police response and the dismissive attitude the Swansons encountered when they first reported him missing led to legislative action. In 2009, Minnesota passed Brandon's Law, which requires law enforcement agencies to immediately begin investigating reports of missing adults. The law prohibits police from refusing to take a missing persons report based on the assumption that the person left voluntarily, that too little time has passed, or that no criminal activity appears to be involved. It also requires the agency that takes the report to serve as the lead investigating agency, a distinction that had caused jurisdictional confusion during the search for Brandon when 3 different counties were involved. Governor Tim Pawlenty signed the bill into law with Brian, Annette, and their daughter Jameen standing beside him. Brandon's law has been credited with saving lives. It changed the way Minnesota handles missing persons cases and ensured that no other family would be told in the critical early hours of a disappearance that their loved one had the right to be missing. Brandon Swanson's name is now part of state law. His name means something in Minnesota. It means that when a family says someone is missing, the police listen. The Swansons left their porch light on every night for at least 5 years after Brandon disappeared. A light in the window for a son who has not come home. Annette once said that as long as that light was on, she felt like she was still waiting for him, and that maybe, somewhere out in the dark, he could see it. As of this recording, that light has reportedly never been turned off. Brandon Victor Swanson has been missing since May 14, 2008. He was 19 years old. He had brown hair, wore glasses, and stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. His case is classified as endangered missing by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. If you have any information, the number to call is 877-996-62202. Let us pause here for a moment, because there is something about Brandon's story that I think is worth sitting with before we move on. The thing that makes this case so deeply unsettling is not the mystery of what happened after the call dropped. It is the 47 minutes before it did. 47 minutes of a son talking to his parents. 47 minutes of a family trying to find each other in the dark. 47 minutes of a voice that was right there, alive, frustrated, walking through a field, and then gone. Every parent who has ever waited up for their child to come home can feel the weight of that call. Every person who has ever driven a dark road alone, who has ever been lost and uncertain of where they were, who has ever relied on a phone call to be their lifeline, understands the fragility of that connection. Brandon's father heard his son say 2 words and then heard nothing, and he has lived inside that nothing for more than 17 years. Have you ever been on the phone with someone and heard something in their voice that made you uneasy, something that told you, without them saying it, that things were not okay? Have you ever hung up a call and immediately wished you had said something different, asked one more question, stayed on the line just a little longer? Brian Swanson has had 17 years to think about that call, 17 years to wonder if there was something he could have said, some question he could have asked that would have changed what happened. And the answer, of course, is that he did everything right. He stayed on the phone. He drove out into the night. He searched. He kept calling. He did everything a father could do. And it was not enough. That is perhaps the most painful part of all. Not that someone failed, but that no one did. And Brandon is still gone. Which brings us to New Hampshire, and to a case that has consumed the internet for more than 20 years. But before we get there, I want to pause on something, because there is a pattern forming here that I think is important to name. When someone disappears in a rural area, the landscape itself becomes a kind of antagonist. In Minnesota, it was the flat, open prairie, the identical gravel roads, the darkness that swallowed the distance between a father and his son. Every one of these stories takes place in a landscape that is too big for the people inside it. The fields are too wide, the roads are too long, The darkness is too deep, and the phone, the device we carry everywhere and trust to keep us connected, becomes a thin wire stretched across an impossible gap. We will see this again in New Hampshire, where the White Mountains and the dense forest create their own kind of isolation. We will see it in Texas, where the scrubland stretches for miles without a single structure or light. And we will see it in Alberta, where the rural roads outside Edmonton turn dark and featureless just minutes from the city. These are not exotic, faraway places. They are the ordinary landscapes of North America, and they are the places where people disappear. There is something else worth mentioning here, something that connects all four stories we are covering tonight. In every single case, the initial response from law enforcement was inadequate. Brandon Swanson's parents were told their son had the right to be missing. Maura Murray's case was initially treated as a missing persons case, not a criminal matter. Brandon Lawson's 911 call was dispatched as a stranded motorist, not a man in danger. And Amber Tuccaro was removed from the missing persons database within a month of being reported missing. In every case, the families had to fight to be taken seriously. In every case, critical time was lost. This is not a coincidence. It reflects something about how we think about missing adults. There is an assumption, sometimes spoken and sometimes not, that adults who disappear have chosen to do so, that they are exercising their right to leave, that they will come back when they are ready. And in some cases, that might be true. But in the cases we are talking about tonight, that assumption cost time, evidence, and possibly lives. Now, let us talk about Maura Murray. Maura Murray's case is one of the most discussed disappearances in modern American history, and for good reason. Not because of what is known, but because of everything that is not. Because in the years since she vanished on a frozen February night in 2004, the details that have emerged about the days leading up to her disappearance have only made the story more confusing, not less. Every new piece of information has raised two more questions. Every theory has its flaws. And the simplest question of all, where did she go, still has no answer. To understand Maura Murray, you have to understand that she was, by most outward measures, exactly the kind of person you would never expect to disappear. She was 21 years old, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Before that, she had attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, one of the most competitive and demanding institutions in the country. She transferred out after her sophomore year, but the fact that she was there at all tells you something about her drive and discipline. She was a former high school track star. She was intelligent. She was capable. She had a boyfriend named Bill Rausch who was serving in the military. She had family who loved her, including her father Fred, a man who would go on to devote years of his life to searching for her. She had plans. She had a future. But in the weeks and days before February 9, 2004, there were signs that something was wrong. And this is where Maura Murray's case becomes difficult to talk about, because no one, not investigators, not journalists, not her family, fully agrees on what those signs meant. Were they evidence of a young woman in crisis? Were they red flags pointing toward a deliberate departure? Or were they just the ordinary complications of a 21-year-old's life, amplified by hindsight into something they never were? In November 2003, 3 months before her disappearance, Maura had been caught using a stolen credit card to order food from the local restaurants. The charge was continued in court with the understanding that it would be dismissed after 3 months of good behavior. This is not an insignificant detail, but it is also not an extraordinary one. College students make mistakes. The charge was relatively minor, and it was being resolved through the legal system. On the evening of February 5th, 2004, Maura was working her security job on the UMass campus when she received a phone call. After the call, she broke down in tears. Her supervisor found her at her desk completely unresponsive. He described her as zoned out, with no reaction at all. He eventually escorted her back to her dorm room around 1:20 in the morning. When he asked what was wrong, Maura said 2 words: "My sister." The contents of that phone call would remain unknown to the public for over 13 years. It was not until October 2017 that Maura's older sister, Kathleen, publicly explained what the conversation had been about. Kathleen, who was struggling with alcohol addiction, had been discharged from a rehabilitation clinic and had relapsed. She had called Maura to talk about the situation and about problems in her relationship with her fiancé. Kathleen's crisis was real, and the emotional weight of it clearly hit Maura hard. But it was a family matter, a private conversation between 2 sisters, and it has been analyzed and speculated about by strangers on the internet for 2 decades. 2 days later, on Saturday, February 7th, Maura was involved in a single-car accident. She was driving her father Fred Murray's new Toyota Corolla and crashed into a guardrail. The car sustained significant damage. She called her father, who came and picked her up. He rented a car for her to use and spent that weekend with her at UMass. They went car shopping together, looking for a replacement for Maura's aging Saturn. Then came Monday, February 9th. And this is the day that has been examined minute by minute for more than 2 decades. Maura went about her morning on campus, and then, at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she emailed her boyfriend Bill. The subject line read, "Hey, hey." The body of the message was short and loving. "I love you more, stud. I got your messages, but honestly, I did not feel like talking to much of anyone. I promised to call today though. Love you, Maura." She never made that call. Shortly after, Maura contacted a fellow nursing student to arrange the return of some borrowed clothing. She dropped the items off at the student's dorm. Then, at 1:24 in the afternoon, she emailed her professors and her work supervisor to let them know she would be heading home for a week due to a death in the family. There had been no death in the family. This is one of the details that haunts Maura's case. She fabricated a family emergency to buy herself time away from campus. Why? If she needed a few days off, why not simply ask? What was she planning that required a lie? At 2:05 in the afternoon, Maura called a toll-free tourism number for Stowe, Vermont. The call lasted less than a minute. The reservation line was down, and no accommodation was booked. But the call itself reveals something. Stowe is a resort town in the Green Mountains. It is northeast of Amherst, in the general direction Maura would ultimately drive. She was looking for a place to stay, somewhere to the north. At 2:18, she tried to call Bill Roush, but he did not pick up because he was trying to call one of Maura's friends at the same time. 2 people trying to reach each other and missing. The kind of thing that happens constantly and means nothing, unless it turns out to be the last time. Then Maura went to an ATM in Hadley, Massachusetts, and withdrew $280. That was nearly all the money in her account. From there, she drove to Liquors 44, also in Hadley, where she returned 79 cans and bottles for a few dollars and purchased a bottle of Kahlua, a bottle of vodka, a small bottle of Bailey's, and a 12-pack of Smirnoff Ice. Around 4 in the afternoon, she stopped at the police station and picked up duplicate copies of accident report forms from the crash 2 days earlier. Those forms were later found in her car. At 4:37 in the afternoon, Maura checked her voicemail. This is the last recorded call she made. Then she left. She packed a bag. She got in her black 1996 Saturn and drove north, approximately 140 miles, into New Hampshire. When campus police later searched her dorm room, they found her belongings neatly packed in boxes and her wall art taken down. Some have interpreted this as evidence of a permanent departure. Others point out that there may be innocent explanations. This detail has become a kind of mirror. People see in it whatever supports the theory they already hold. Picture the road she was on, Route 112 in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It is narrow and winding, 2 lanes at most, bordered by thick stands of birch and pine. In summer, scenic. In February, at night, with ice and snow, it is something else entirely. 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Dark by late afternoon. No street lights, no cell service. Sometime between 7 and 7:30 that evening, Maura's Saturn skidded off the road and hit a snowbank at a curve in the town of Haverhill. The windshield cracked in a spiderweb pattern, consistent with a head impact. The airbags did not deploy. The car was inoperable. A local resident named Faith Westman saw the accident from her home and called 911 at 7:27. A school bus driver named Butch Atwood, driving past, stopped to help. He spoke with the young woman at the car. She seemed shaken but alert. She told him she had already called AAA for a tow. He offered to call the police or give her a ride to his house. She declined both. He drove home and called 911 at 7:42. Officer Cecil Smith was dispatched at 7:29. His arrival at the scene is estimated at between 7:45 and 7:46. By the time he got there, Maura Murray was gone. 7 minutes and maybe 8. That is the window. Somewhere in those 7 or 8 minutes between Butch Atwood driving away and the officer arriving, a 21-year-old woman vanished from the scene of a car accident on a frozen rural road. Her car was still there, locked. A rag stuffed into the tailpipe, a box of wine spilled on the back seat, her belongings scattered inside, but no Maura, no footprints leading into the snow, no sign of a second vehicle. Let me ask you to sit with that for a moment. 7 minutes. In 7 minutes, you can make a cup of coffee. You can listen to half a song. You can scroll through a few posts on your phone. In 7 minutes on a cold February night in rural New Hampshire, a young woman disappeared so completely that more than 20 years of searching, theorizing, investigating, and obsessing have failed to produce a single confirmed piece of evidence about where she went. A witness later reported seeing what appeared to be a police SUV parked at the scene between approximately 7:33 and 7:37 before Officer Smith is documented as arriving. If accurate, this means an unidentified vehicle was at the scene during the critical window. Who was driving it and whether they had any interaction with Maura has never been publicly resolved. This detail has generated enormous speculation. Some believe it was a local law enforcement vehicle that was never officially documented. Others believe it was a civilian vehicle that happened to resemble a police SUV. The witness's account has been scrutinized, questioned, and debated, but it has never been definitively explained. There was no cell service at that location. Whatever Maura told Atwood about calling for a tow, she could not have made that call. Was she trying to send him away so she could deal with the situation on her own? Was she worried about a potential DUI, given the alcohol in the car and the cracked windshield? Was she planning to walk to a nearby house or business? Was she waiting for someone she had arranged to meet? These questions have circled for 20 years without landing on solid ground. The theories about what happened to Maura Murray could fill a book. In fact, they have filled books. Journalist James Renner wrote True Crime Addict, in which he proposed that Maura may have disappeared voluntarily, possibly with the help of a second driver, to start a new life. He pointed to the lie about the death in the family, the packed dorm room, the cash withdrawal, the alcohol purchases, and the pending legal issue as evidence of a planned departure. The Murray family has rejected this theory firmly. Fred Murray has said plainly that he believes his daughter was abducted and is dead. Others have focused on the stretch of road itself and the people who live nearby. In late 2004, a local man named Larry Moulton gave Fred Murray a rusty knife that had belonged to his brother Claude, who had a criminal record and had lived less than a mile from the crash site. The knife was eventually turned over to the New Hampshire State Police. In later years, a property connected to this individual was searched. Carpet samples were taken and sent to the crime lab. The results were never released to the public. Whether this lead went anywhere, or whether it was a dead end like so many others, remains unknown. In July 2008, volunteers conducted a 2-day search through wooded areas in Haverhill. Dog teams and licensed private investigators participated. They found nothing. In 2010, Fred publicly criticized the investigation for treating the case as a missing person matter rather than a criminal one, and called on the FBI to join. Senior Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Strelzin stated in 2009 that the investigation was still active and that the state was treating it as a potential homicide, even though they could not confirm that Maura was a victim of a crime. The March 2004 disappearance of another young woman, 17-year-old Brianna Maitland, in Montgomery, Vermont, about 66 miles from where Maura was last seen, drew immediate comparisons. Maitland's car was found abandoned, backed into the side of an empty farmhouse with the headlights still on. State police in both New Hampshire and Vermont investigated whether the two cases were connected and ultimately concluded there was no link. But for the families and for the public following both cases, the proximity in time and geography was hard to ignore. Maura's case has become one of those rare disappearances that has taken on a life of its own in the public imagination. There are multiple podcasts dedicated to it. There have been television series. There are websites and forums and social media groups with thousands of members, all devoted to analyzing every detail of her last days. Some of this attention has been constructive. It has kept the case in the public eye. It has generated tips. It has put pressure on law enforcement to keep investigating, but some of it has been harmful. Family members have been accused. Innocent people have been named as suspects in online forums. Misinformation has spread and been repeated so many times that it has become difficult to separate fact from speculation. Julie Murray has spoken about the toll this takes on the family. She has said that for 20 years, strangers have told her family's story, often getting it wrong, often projecting their own theories onto a situation they do not understand. The podcast she started in 2024 was, in part, an effort to reclaim that narrative. Fred Murray came to New Hampshire nearly every weekend for years. He searched on foot. He organized volunteers. He knocked on doors. He walked into the woods alone. In April 2004, just 2 months after Maura disappeared, he was told that his searching was generating trespassing complaints from local residents. His daughter was missing somewhere in those woods, and the neighbors were bothered by a father looking for her. The family believes Maura was abducted and killed. Fred has stated this publicly. The New Hampshire State Police treat the case as a potential homicide. It was added to the state's cold case unit in 2009. There is one more detail I want to mention before we move on, because it captures something essential about this case. In 2024, around the 20th anniversary of Maura's disappearance, the family put up billboards in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. The billboards displayed Maura's photograph and asked for information. 20 years after a young woman vanished on a winter road, her family was still buying billboards, still spending money and time and emotional energy to keep her face in front of the public. That is what it looks like when a family refuses to let the world forget. The last thing Maura Murray wrote to anyone was a love note to her boyfriend. I promised to call today, though. She never kept that promise, not because she did not want to, but because somewhere between 4:37 in the afternoon and 7:46 that evening, something happened that took that choice away from her. Whether it was an accident, a crime, or a decision she made herself, no one can say with certainty. And Bill Rausch, who missed her call at 2:18 that afternoon, did not know it was the last time she would try to reach him. He did not know it mattered. And that is the thing about last signals. You never know they are the last until they are. Have you ever driven a road alone at night and felt the darkness close in around you? Have you ever been on a road where the cell service drops and you realize, just for a moment, how alone you really are? Maura Murray drove 140 miles into the New Hampshire mountains on a winter night, and somewhere along that road, she crossed a line from which there was no return. The car is still in evidence. The rag in the tailpipe, the cracked windshield, the spilled wine, all the objects of a life that stopped mid-sentence. On the night of August 8, 2013 in San Angelo, Texas, a 26-year-old man named Brandon Lawson got into an argument with his girlfriend, Ledessa Lofton. They'd been together for about 10 years. They had 3 children together, and Brandon had a daughter from a previous relationship. He worked long hours in the oil fields, the kind of physically demanding, time-consuming labor that pulls you away from your family more than anyone wants. The argument was not unusual. Couples with young children and long working hours argue. It is part of the rhythm of a busy, stressful life. What made this argument different is that Brandon had not come home the night before, and Ledessa had reason to believe he had relapsed into drug use. Brandon's brother Kyle would later confirm that Brandon had been using methamphetamine around the time of his disappearance, though he had reportedly been clean for about 6 months prior. Whether Brandon was under the influence that night has been debated extensively, and the answer matters because it changes the lens through which you interpret every phone call, every word, every frightened statement that Brandon made in the hours that followed. I want to be careful here, because it is easy to let that detail, the drug use, become the whole story. It is easy to say, well, he was on drugs, and that explains everything, and it might explain some things. But Brandon Lawson was also a father of 4 who worked in the oil fields to provide for his family. He was a person with a complicated life, like most people, and whatever substances may have been in his system that night, he was a human being who was afraid and asking for help and who never came home. That matters more than any toxicology report. At approximately 11:30 in the evening, Brandon called his parents in Crowley, Texas, on the outskirts of Fort Worth, roughly 3 hours from San Angelo. He told them he was coming over. He wanted to cool off. He got in his truck and headed out into the August night. Ledessa called his phone around midnight and asked him to come home, or at least to go to his brother Kyle's place instead of driving 3 hours in the middle of the night. Brandon did not agree. At 12:38 in the morning on August 9th, Brandon called Kyle. His truck had run out of gas on Highway 277 near the town of Bronte, about 40 miles north of San Angelo. This is a desolate stretch of road. Picture a 2-lane highway cutting through open ranch country in scrubland. The towns are sparse. The vegetation is low, mostly mesquite and cedar and dry grass. In the daytime, it is the kind of landscape that bakes under a merciless Texas sun, the kind of place where the heat shimmer makes the road look wet in the distance. At night, that same landscape becomes something else entirely. The sky opens up, enormous and indifferent, and the darkness is thick and heavy and silent. Highway 277 between San Angelo and Abilene is the kind of road that most people drive without thinking about. You are on it for a while, and then you are off it, and you barely remember the in-between. It is a road for passing through, not for stopping. But at 12:38 in the morning, with an empty gas tank and no gas station for miles, Brandon Lawson was stuck on that road, and things were about to get very strange. Kyle told Ledessa what had happened. She put a gas can on the front porch. Kyle, his girlfriend Audrey, and their young son got in the car and drove toward Bronte to help. It was late. They had a small child with them. But that is what family does. You get in the car and you go. During the drive, Kyle and Brandon called each other on and off. The calls were frustrating. Cell reception out there is unreliable at the best of times. And in the middle of the night, with only 1 or 2 towers serving a large area, the connection was spotty. Some calls dropped immediately. Others connected, but only lasted a few seconds before Brandon hung up. He was not holding conversations. He was making brief, fragmented statements and then ending the call. During one of these calls, Brandon said something that alarmed Kyle. He said that 3 guys were chasing him out of town. He mentioned the Mexicans in the neighborhood. Kyle asked him directly if he was hallucinating. Brandon denied it. There is a timeline that has been pieced together from phone records and the accounts of the people involved, and I want to walk through it carefully because the details matter. At 12:34 and 12:36 in the morning, Ledessa missed 2 calls from Brandon. At 12:38, Brandon called Kyle. At 12:40, Kyle called Ledessa to tell her about the gas situation. At 12:48, Ledessa missed another call from Brandon. Then, at 12:50, came the call that would change everything. Then, at 12:50 in the morning, Brandon called 911. The call was routed to a nursing home in nearby Robert Lee, Texas, where a staff member served as the after-hours dispatcher for the area. The recording of this call has become one of the most analyzed pieces of audio in true crime history. The sound quality is poor. Brandon's voice is rushed and panicked. Parts of what he says are audible and parts are swallowed by static, wind, or his own breathlessness. Here is what can be reasonably made out from publicly available transcripts. Brandon said to the dispatcher, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field," followed by partially inaudible words that many have interpreted as pushed some guys over. He continued, "Right here, going toward Abilene, on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's 1 car here, The guys chasing, and then more inaudible words, possibly to the woods. He said, "Please hurry." The dispatcher asked if he needed an ambulance. Brandon's reply was clear. "No, I need the cops." There are portions of the recording that some listeners believe contain a second voice. Others believe they can hear what sounds like a gunshot in the background. Whether Brandon said something that sounds like "shot the first guy" is heavily disputed. Audio forensics is an imperfect science, especially with a low-quality cell phone recording from a rural area with spotty reception. But what is not in dispute is the fear in Brandon's voice. Whatever he was experiencing, real or imagined, he believed he was in danger. After the 911 call, the dispatcher called Brandon back twice, starting at 1:04 in the morning. Both calls went to voicemail. Brandon also called Kyle's girlfriend, Audrey. She was the last person confirmed to have spoken with him directly. During a call around 1:18, Kyle reached Brandon, who sounded winded and said he was bleeding. Then came the moment that haunts this case. At around 1:10 in the morning, Kyle arrived at Brandon's abandoned truck on Highway 277. A sheriff's deputy had already arrived, dispatched after a separate 911 call from a trucker who reported a vehicle blocking a lane. Kyle was on the phone with Brandon at this point, and Brandon said, "I can see you. I am right here." Kyle looked around. The deputy looked around. Neither of them could see Brandon anywhere. The highway was empty. The scrubland was dark. Brandon said he was there, and he was not. Kyle, aware that his brother had an outstanding arrest warrant for drug possession with intent to deliver, assumed Brandon might be hiding in the brush because of the police presence. Neither Kyle nor the deputy knew that Brandon himself had called 911 and asked the police to come. The wires were crossed. The information was incomplete. The deputy had been dispatched to a report of a stranded motorist, not a man begging for help. Kyle spoke briefly with the officer, confirmed the truck was Brandon's, and the deputy departed. Kyle left the gas can in the truck bed and drove a short distance up the road to wait. He parked and sat there for 30 to 45 minutes. Brandon never appeared. After 1:19 in the morning, all calls to Brandon's phone went directly to voicemail. Kyle finally left to go feed his young son. He did not know he was leaving for the last time. Brandon Lawson was never seen or heard from again. The search that followed was extensive but frustrating. The landscape along Highway 277 is flat and sparse, but the brush is thick enough to conceal a person lying on the ground. In the days after Brandon's disappearance, deputies organized a search party and spent hours investigating the area around his truck. They found nothing. Volunteers from the San Angelo community joined the effort. Search dogs were brought in. The terrain was walked and re-walked. But Highway 277 near Bronte is the kind of place where the land does not give up its secrets easily. The brush is low and scrubby, mostly mesquite and cedar. The ground is hard and dry. There are no convenient trails or paths. You just walk into it and hope you're looking in the right direction. Imagine standing at the spot where Brandon's truck was parked. It is daytime now. The heat is pressing down from a white Texas sky. You can see the highway stretching in both directions, straight as a ruler, disappearing into the shimmer of distance. On either side, the scrubland extends to the horizon. It looks like you should be able to see everything. It looks open, but step 10 feet off the road, and the brush closes around you. The ground dips and rises in subtle ways that are invisible from the highway. A person could be lying 40 yards from the road, and you would never know it. That is what the search teams were dealing with. and they were dealing with it for years. The case attracted enormous attention online, largely because of the 9/11 recording. True crime communities dissected the audio obsessively. The recording was posted on YouTube, shared across Reddit and Facebook, transcribed and retranscribed by amateur sleuths. People slowed it down. They amplified it. They filtered out background noise. Everyone had a theory about what Brandon was saying in the parts that are not clear. Some heard push some guys over. Others heard shot the first guy. Some were certain there was a second voice. Others were not. The debate over the 911 call became, for a time, one of the most discussed topics in the online true crime world. Ledessa, along with Brandon's family, created a Facebook page called Help Find Brandon Lawson. Over the years, it grew to more than 29,000 followers. Think about that for a moment. 29,000 people, most of whom never knew Brandon Lawson personally, following his case because his story and his family's grief resonated with them. Ledessa posted regular updates. She organized additional searches. She fielded tips from strangers. She kept the conversation going, year after year, even when there was nothing new to report, even when the silence stretched on and on. There is a particular kind of endurance required to maintain hope over that many years. It is not just emotional. It is logistical. You have to keep a website updated. You have to respond to messages. You have to talk to journalists. You have to keep your children's father's story alive in a world that moves quickly to the next headline. Ledessa did that for over 11 years. For nearly 9 years, there were no answers. Then, in early February 2022, a private search team found something. A pile of clothing near Brandon's last known location. A yellow shirt, green camouflage shorts, white Nike sneakers. The clothing matched exactly what Brandon had been wearing the night he disappeared 9 years earlier. The search team contacted the Texas Rangers, who expanded the search and near the clothing discovered human remains, including a portion of a skull. The remains were found approximately 1 mile from where Brandon's truck had been parked on the highway. 1 mile. That number is almost impossible to absorb. For 9 years, his family searched. For 9 years, volunteers walked the terrain. For 9 years, people analyzed the 911 call, pored over satellite images, and debated whether Brandon had gone north or south from his truck, and his remains were 1 mile away. The DNA testing was slow and agonizing. The remains had been exposed to the Texas elements for nearly a decade. Summer heat that regularly exceeds 100 degrees, freezing winter nights, rain, wind, animals. The biological material was degraded, and extracting usable DNA required patience and advanced techniques. It took nearly 3 years. On December 25th, 2024, Christmas Day, Ledessa posted on the Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page. The Texas Ranger in charge of Brandon's case had called the family a few days before the holiday with the news they had been waiting for since February 2022. The laboratory had confirmed that the remains were Brandon's. The DNA comparison with his father showed an 82% genetic match. Christmas Day, of all the days to receive that news. Ledessa wrote that their main focus throughout the entire ordeal had been to bring Brandon home so he could rest in peace. And now, after 11 years and 4 months, they could do that. In July 2025, Brandon's remains were finally released to his family by the district attorney of Coke County. There had been complications and delays, the kind of bureaucratic frustrations that compound grief in ways that are hard to explain to someone who has not experienced them. Your loved one's remains are found, but you cannot have them. The system has its processes. The paperwork takes time, and you wait again for the thing you have already waited so long for. A memorial service was held on August 30th, 2025 in Burleson, Texas. Ledessa said her heart was broken, but that she was grateful to bring him home. The family's announcement included a quote from Charles Dickens. "It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known." The family expressed their gratitude to the community that had walked with them for over a decade. The 29,000 followers on Facebook, the volunteers, the advocates, the strangers who became family through the simple act of caring about a missing man they had never met. Brandon Lawson's death is listed as a homicide by Texas state-level investigators. No official cause of death has been released. No arrests have been made. The Texas Rangers continued their investigation and are asking anyone with information to come forward. The Texas Crime Stoppers hotline is 1-800-252-8477. His remains were 1 mile from his truck. For 9 years, that distance, a distance you could walk in 20 minutes, separated his family from the answers they needed. Search teams had been in the area. Volunteers had walked that ground, and somehow, Brandon was there the whole time, hidden by low brush and the passage of years. The unanswered questions are enormous. What happened between the 911 call and Brandon's death? Were the people he described real? Was the threat genuine? Did he encounter someone on that dark highway who meant him harm? Or did he run into the scrubland in a chemically altered state of panic, injure himself, and die alone in the dark, his body hidden by the terrain and the elements? The fact that his case is classified as a homicide by state investigators suggests that law enforcement believes something criminal occurred. But without a confirmed cause of death and without an arrest, the full truth remains out of reach. What we know is this: a 26-year-old father of 4 called 911 begging for help. He told his brother he could see him. He said he was right there, and no one could find him. For 11 years, no one could find him. And when they finally did, it was because a private search team, not law enforcement, stumbled across his clothing in the brush. There is something profoundly troubling about that. The families in these cases are often the ones doing the work. They are the ones maintaining the Facebook pages and organizing the searches and keeping the story alive. They are the ones who refuse to accept the silence. And in Brandon Lawson's case, it was a team connected to the family. Advocates who had followed the case for years, who found the evidence that law enforcement had not. Let us talk about something before we move to the next case, because there is a thread running through all 4 of these stories that I want to pull on. In every case we have discussed tonight, there is a moment where the person on the phone is trying to communicate something essential, something urgent, and the communication fails. Not because the words are not spoken, but because the system meant to receive those words is broken in some fundamental way. Brandon Swanson told his parents he was near Lind, and they drove to Lind, and he was not there. The geography lied. The darkness made everything look the same, and a 19-year-old without GPS had no way to know he was 25 miles from where he thought he was. Maura Murray told a stranger she had already called for help, and the stranger believed her and drove away. Whether she was lying or confused, the result was the same. The person who might have stayed with her left. Brandon Lawson called 911 and said he needed the cops. and a deputy was dispatched to a report of a stranded motorist, not a man in danger. The urgency in his voice was filtered through a system that did not transmit it. By the time the deputy arrived, he found an empty truck and no reason to launch a search. And Amber Tuccaro told the driver of the car that he had better not be taking her anywhere she did not want to go, and the words were recorded, and the recording was filed away and not released for 2 years, and by the time anyone heard it, Amber had been dead for months. In every case, the signal was sent, and in every case, the signal was received by someone, somewhere, but the response was inadequate. The system failed. The distance was too great, the darkness too deep, the bureaucracy too slow, the assumptions too careless. I am not saying this to blame the police officers or the dispatchers or the families who did everything they could. I am saying it because these failures are not random. They are systemic. They reflect the way our society responds to people who go missing in rural and remote areas. They reflect the assumptions we make about young adults, about Indigenous women, about people with complicated lives, and they remind us that the technology we carry in our pockets, the devices we trust to keep us connected and safe, are only as useful as the systems and the people on the other end of the line. Now let us talk about Amber Tuccaro, and let us talk about what happens when the voice of a killer is captured on tape and still, 15 years later, no one has been held accountable. Before we begin this story, I want to acknowledge something. The 3 cases we have discussed so far involve people who disappeared and whose last communications were heard only by their families. What they said on those phone calls is known to us through the memories of the people who were listening. But the case we are about to discuss is different. In this case, there is a recording. The last moments of communication between a young woman and her family exist as an audio file that anyone can listen to. I have listened to it. Many of you may have listened to it too, and I want to say this carefully. When you listen to a recording like that, you are not just consuming content, you are hearing a real person's final moments of freedom. The voice on that tape belongs to someone's daughter, someone's mother. She was 20 years old. She had a baby waiting for her, and she was afraid. I share this case because it needs to be shared, because there is a killer's voice on that recording, and someone out there knows who it belongs to. But I share it with the understanding that we are talking about a human being who deserved so much better than what happened to her. Amber Alyssa Tuccaro was born on January 3rd, 1990, in northern Alberta, Canada. She was a member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation. She was adopted as a baby by Andrew and Vivian Tuccaro, who everyone called Tootsie. She grew up in a family with 4 older brothers who loved her and a mother who has described her as witty, sharp, and fiercely loyal to the people she cared about. By 2010, Amber was 20 years old and living in Fort McMurray, Alberta, with her mother and her 14-month-old son, Jacob. She was a young mother, navigating the same things that any 20-year-old with a baby navigates. Money was tight, life was busy. But her mother has said many times, in many interviews, that Amber would never have left her son. She says it the way someone says it when they need you to understand that this is not a theory or a character reference, it is a fact. Amber would never have left Jacob, and that makes everything that happened next not just a mystery, but a crime. On August 17th, 2010, Amber flew from Fort McMurray to Edmonton with Jacob and a female friend. The plan was simple. A short trip, a couple of days in the city, To save money, they booked a room at a modest motel in Nisku, an industrial area south of Edmonton, near the airport. Nisku is not a place you would go for the scenery. It is truck stops and warehouses and the kind of budget accommodations that serve the oil patch workers and transient travelers who pass through the area. The plan was to stay the night and head into Edmonton the next day. On the evening of August 18th, Amber left the motel alone, looking for a ride into the city. At approximately 8 in the evening, she accepted a ride from an unknown man. This is the last time anyone saw Amber Tuccaro alive. Now here is the detail that separates Amber's case from almost any other. While Amber was in the car with this stranger, she received a phone call. The call was from her brother, who was incarcerated at the Edmonton Remand Center. Earlier that year, the facility had begun automatically recording all outgoing calls made by inmates, every call, without exception, which means that the entire conversation between Amber and her brother, 14 minutes and 52 seconds of it, was captured on tape. And in the background of that recording, you can hear the man who was driving the car. His voice is audible, not muffled, not distant. You can hear him speaking. He tells Amber they are heading north, toward 50th Street, east on a back road toward Edmonton. But investigators believe the man was not driving north. They believe he was driving south, deeper into the rural landscape of Leduc County, away from the city and away from anywhere Amber wanted to go. And on the recording, you can hear it. You can hear the moment when Amber senses something is wrong. She says it clearly, loud enough for her brother to hear through the phone. "You better not be taking me anywhere I do not want to go." Think about those words. Think about what it takes to say that to a stranger who is driving your car. Think about the vulnerability of that moment. She is in someone else's vehicle. She does not know this man. She does not know where they are. And she is brave enough, or frightened enough, to say it out loud. The call ends shortly after that. Whether it was disconnected, or whether Amber ended it, or whether something else happened is not entirely clear from the publicly available information. What is clear is that after the call, Amber's phone went silent. Her mother Tootsie had been texting with her all day, a steady back and forth the way mothers and daughters do. And then, suddenly, nothing. Tootsie kept calling and texting. No response. Not that night. Not the next morning. When Tootsie contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, to report her daughter missing, she was told that Amber was probably out partying. They told her she needed to wait 24 hours before they would initiate a missing persons investigation. Amber had a 14-month-old baby at the motel. She was not out partying. Her mother knew that. The police did not listen. What followed was one of the most thoroughly documented failures in Canadian law enforcement history. The RCMP did not begin investigating Amber's disappearance until a full month after she was reported missing. A month. 30 days of nothing while a young mother was missing and her baby was waiting for her. It took 4 months before officers conducted a single interview, a delay that a Federal Review Commission later described as unreasonable and unexplained. Amber was briefly listed as a missing person, then removed from the database based on unconfirmed alleged sightings, then reinstated a month later after her mother fought to get her back on the list. And during the period when Amber was removed from the missing persons list, some of her personal property that police had collected was destroyed. Property that might have served as evidence was gone because the system had decided, prematurely, that she was not really missing. The Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP released its findings in 2018. The report concluded that the investigation was deficient and did not comply with established procedures and guidelines. The Tuccaro family and advocates for Indigenous women across Canada have pointed to Amber's case as an example of a systemic failure that has been repeated hundreds of times across the country. Amber's case is part of a larger, devastating pattern. Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, which released its final report in 2019, documented thousands of cases in which Indigenous women and girls disappeared or were killed, and their cases were mishandled, ignored, or abandoned by law enforcement. The inquiry found that the violence was systemic and that it was rooted in colonialism, racism, and sexism. It described the situation as a Canadian genocide. Amber's story is one of many, and that phrase, one of many, is itself part of the problem. When a tragedy is repeated so often that it becomes a pattern, there is a danger that the individual stories get lost inside the statistics. Each of those statistics was a person. Each of those numbers had a name and a family and a life that was cut short. Amber Tuccaro was not a statistic. She was a 20-year-old woman who loved her baby and flew to Edmonton for a couple of days and got into a car with the wrong person and never came home. The area where Amber's remains were found, rural Leduc County, has become a place of particular significance in discussions about missing and murdered Indigenous women in Alberta. The remains of at least 4 other women have been discovered within a few kilometers of where Amber was found: Corrie Renee Ottenbreit, Dolores Brower, and others whose names have been released over the years. This concentration of remains in one relatively small area has led investigators and advocates to consider the possibility that a serial predator was operating in the region. The RCMP has stated publicly that they have not ruled this out. In 2007, years before Amber's disappearance, the RCMP acknowledged that they were investigating the possibility of one or more serial killers targeting Edmonton area women. The Nisku industrial area where Amber was staying sits along a corridor that has been described by advocates as particularly dangerous for women, especially Indigenous women. It is an area of transient workers, industrial businesses, truck traffic, and budget motels. It is the kind of place where people pass through and do not stay long, where strangers interact briefly and move on, where a young woman looking for a ride into the city might accept one from someone she does not know because there are no other options. I want to be careful about how I frame this, because there is a tendency in discussions about missing and murdered Indigenous women to focus on the choices the victims made, the risks they took, the places they went, as if those choices are the explanation for what happened to them. They are not. Amber Tuccaro did not disappear because she accepted a ride from a stranger. She disappeared because the man who gave her that ride chose to do something terrible. The responsibility lies with the person who committed the crime, not with the person who was victimized by it. In August 2012, almost 2 years after Amber disappeared, the RCMP released a 1-minute excerpt of the recorded phone call to the public. The decision to release it was unusual. The RCMP typically shares very little about active investigations before they go to court. But in this case, the recording was the best evidence they had, and they needed the public's help. If someone could identify the voice of the man in the car, it could break the case open. 4 days after the recording was released, horseback riders discovered human remains in a field in Leduc County, south of the motel where Amber had been staying. The timing was striking, coming just days after the public heard the recording, though the RCMP stated the two events were not connected. The remains were identified through dental records as belonging to Amber Tuccaro. Her cause of death was not publicly released. Her case was taken over by the RCMP's KARE unit, which investigates unsolved homicides and disappearances of vulnerable persons. The discovery confirmed what the recording had suggested. The driver lied to Amber. He told her they were heading into the city. He drove her in the opposite direction, south into rural Leduc County, into the darkness of farmland and unpaved roads, and he left her in a field where her remains would lie for 2 years before anyone found them. Think about that geography for a moment. Amber was at a motel near the Edmonton airport. Edmonton, a city of over 1 million people, was just a short drive north. The lights of the city were visible in the distance. She wanted to go north, into those lights, into the safety of a populated area. And the man who was driving her went south, away from the lights, away from the people, into the empty fields where no one would see and no one would hear. He knew exactly what he was doing. His calm voice on the recording, giving false directions, telling Amber they were heading toward the city, is the voice of a person who had a plan. The remains of at least 4 other women have been discovered within a few kilometers of where Amber was found. This is not a coincidence that anyone is comfortable ignoring. Corey Renee Ottenbright's remains were found in Leduc County in 2015. Dolores Brower's remains were found on a rural property in the same area in 2015 as well, more than 11 years after she disappeared. The concentration of remains in this one area has led investigators and community members alike to ask the question that no one wants to ask, but everyone is thinking. Is there a serial predator operating in the rural areas south of Edmonton? The RCMP has said publicly they are not ruling it out. In 2020, a man in the United States posted on social media claiming that the voice on the recording belonged to his father. He said his father had a criminal history and that he believed he could be responsible for multiple missing persons cases in Alberta. The RCMP acknowledged the tip and investigated. They reviewed the individual's claims and determined that many of the specific cases he referenced had already been solved. Whether the tip led to any concrete progress in Amber's case specifically has not been publicly confirmed. As of the time of this recording, no arrest has been made. Amber Tuccaro's killer remains unidentified. I want to talk about Jacob for a moment, because in the broader conversation about this case, in the analysis of the recording and the failures of the RCMP and the patterns of violence against Indigenous women, it can be easy to lose sight of the most immediate human consequence. Jacob was 14 months old when his mother left the motel in Nisku and did not come back. He was a baby. He did not understand why his mother was not there. He could not understand why she would never be there again. Tutsi Tuccaro, Amber's mother, took Jacob in and raised him. She has spoken in interviews about what that is like, about watching her grandson grow up and seeing her daughter in him, the way he stands, the way he says certain words, the attitude he carries. She has said he has his mother's wit, her sharpness, her stubbornness. She sees Amber in him every day, and that is both a comfort and a source of pain that does not fade. Jacob is a teenager now. He is growing up without his mother because a man whose voice is on a tape that the police have had since 2010 has never been identified. 15 years of that voice sitting in an evidence file. 15 years of Tootsie raising her grandson and waiting for justice. Amber's mother traveled to Ottawa in 2015 for the first National Roundtable on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. That trip came just 1 year after the death of her husband, Andrew. She has spoken at conferences and to journalists and in documentary films, always with the same message. Her daughter deserves justice. Her grandson deserves answers. And the system that was supposed to protect them failed. If that person is listening to this right now, if you recognize the voice on that recording, Amber's family is asking you to come forward. Alberta RCMP can be reached at 780-412-5261. Tips can also be submitted to Project KARE at 1-877-412-5273 or anonymously through Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-8477. Have you ever listened to a recording and recognized a voice? Think about every voice you know, not just the people closest to you, but the wider circle. Your neighbor across the street, the person who works at the hardware store, the guy who used to give you a ride to work. Someone, somewhere, knows that voice. And every day that passes without that person coming forward is another day that Jacob does not have an answer about what happened to his mother. We have been sitting with 4 stories tonight, 4 people, 4 last signals. And I think what stays with me more than the theories or the timelines or the evidence is the people who are on the other end, the people who picked up the phone, the people who answered the call, the people who heard a voice they loved and then lost it. There is a concept in grief counseling called ambiguous loss. I mentioned it earlier and I want to return to it now because it is the thread that connects all 4 families. Ambiguous loss is the kind of grief that comes when someone you love is gone but not confirmed dead, or when there is no closure, no definitive answer. The psychologist Pauline Boss, who developed the concept, has written that it is the most difficult kind of loss because it defies resolution. You cannot mourn fully because you do not know for certain what you are mourning. You cannot move forward because there is no endpoint. You are frozen in the moment of the last signal, replaying it, analyzing it, wondering if there was something you could have said or done differently that would have changed the outcome. And the answer, almost always, is no. There was nothing you could have done. But that knowledge does not quiet the question. Brian Swanson carries that question every day. What if he had driven farther north? What if he had asked Brandon one more question about what he could see? What if the police had taken the report when it was first made instead of telling him his son had the right to be missing? Brian drove through the darkness, trying to find his boy. He heard him say, "Oh, shit," and then heard nothing. And then he went home and turned on the porch light and waited. Fred Murray carries a different kind of weight. He lost his daughter and then spent years being told by strangers on the internet and sometimes by investigators that maybe she left on purpose. Maybe she wanted to disappear. And he has had to stand up again and again and say, no, something happened to her. She is not hiding. He has searched the woods of New Hampshire in winter. He has organized volunteers. He's been complained about by the neighbors, and he has never stopped. Kyle Lawson carries the weight of proximity. He was there at his brother's truck on the phone with Brandon, who said, "I can see you. I am right there." And Kyle looked around and saw nothing. He left a gas can in the truck bed and drove away, assuming Brandon was hiding from the police because of the warrant. He did not know his brother had called 911 himself. He did not know Brandon was in danger, and the remains of his brother lay 1 mile away in the brush for 9 years. Imagine living with that. Imagine knowing you were that close. Kyle did nothing wrong. He made reasonable decisions based on the information he had, but the gap between what he knew and what was happening is the kind of gap that grief lives inside of forever. Tuccaro carries the weight of a system that failed her daughter and then failed to acknowledge it. She reported Amber missing and was told to wait. She fought to get her daughter back on the missing persons list. She waited years for the recording to be released. She raised her daughter's son and watched him grow into a teenager who will never know his mother. And she has done all of this while navigating the broader injustice of being an Indigenous mother in a country where Indigenous women disappear at disproportionate rates and their cases are handled with disproportionate indifference. These are the people who live inside the silence that follows the last signal, and their grief is not something that happened once and then faded. It is ongoing. It is every morning when you wake up and remember. It is every time you pick up your phone and think for just a fraction of a second that maybe this time it will be them. The families of missing persons carry a weight that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced it. It is not like losing someone to illness, where there is a progression and a farewell and a burial and a grave you can visit. It is not like losing someone in an accident, where there is shock and grief, but also a clear answer. With a disappearance, especially an unresolved one, the grief has no flaw. There is nothing to stand on. Every day could be the day you find out what happened. Every day could be the day that never comes, and you live suspended between hope and horror, year after year, unable to fully grieve because there is no body, no certainty, no end. Brandon Swanson's parents left their porch light on for years. That light was not for the neighbors. It was not decorative. It was a beacon. It said, "We are still here. The door is still open. Come home." Maura, Murray's sister, records a podcast because she refuses to let her sister's name become nothing more than an internet mystery. She says the hardest part is that everyone thinks they know, and nobody actually does. She wants people to remember that behind the theories and the timelines, there is a family that lost someone they love. Brandon Lawson's fiancée maintained a Facebook page for over 11 years, posting updates, fielding tips, keeping the story alive. When the DNA results came back on Christmas Day 2024, she shared the news with the community that had walked alongside her family for over a decade. She said her heart was broken and she was grateful, and both of those things were true at the same time. Amber Tuccaro's case has become one of the most visible examples of the systemic failures faced by Indigenous families in Canada when a loved one goes missing. The recording that exists of her last phone call is both the most important piece of evidence and the most agonizing. Her mother can hear her daughter's voice any time she wants. She can listen and hear Amber speaking, but she also hears the voice of the man who took her away. That is a cruelty for which there are not adequate words. What ties these 4 cases together is not just the phone calls. It is the gap between hearing and saving. In each case, someone was connected. Someone was listening. The signal was there, and it was not enough. The voice was clear, but the darkness was darker. The call was made, but the distance was too great. The plea was heard, but the help did not arrive in time. We live in an age of constant connectivity. Our phones are always with us. We text while we walk and call, while we drive and feel, somewhere in the background of our consciousness, that as long as we are connected, we are safe. That as long as we can reach someone, someone can reach us. These 4 stories quietly dismantle that assumption. A phone call is not a rescue. A text message is not a shield. Hearing someone's voice does not mean you can find them. Being reachable does not mean you are safe. But that does not mean the calls did not matter. They mattered enormously, not because they led to rescues, because they did not, but because they are the last thread of connection between the people who disappeared and the people who loved them. Brandon Swanson's parents have 47 minutes of their son's voice, and that is both a gift and a torment. The recording of Amber Tuccaro's call is the reason her family still has hope of justice. Maura Murray's email is the last piece of evidence that she was thinking of the people she loved. Brandon Lawson's 911 call is the reason anyone outside of Coke County, Texas, knows his name. The calls are what remain. After everything else is gone, the calls are what we have. If there is something to carry with you after tonight, it is not fear. It is not the message that the world is a dangerous place, even though sometimes it is. The message is quieter than that. Answer the call when it comes. Return the text when you see it. Do not assume there will always be another chance, because for the families in tonight's stories, there was not. And if you know something, anything about any of these cases, please come forward. The numbers are in the description of this video. These families have been patient. They have been strong. They have been searching for years. They deserve answers. For Brandon Swanson, call the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension at 877-996-622. For Maura Murray, contact the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit. For Brandon Lawson, the Texas Rangers continue their investigation, and the Crime Stoppers line is 1-800-252-8477. For Amber Tuccaro, Alberta RCMP can be reached at 780-412-5261 or through Project KARE at 1-877-412-5273. These people were not mysteries. They were not content. They were not podcast episodes or Reddit threads or YouTube videos. They were a son, a daughter, a father, a mother. They had names and faces and people who loved them. And somewhere, someone is still waiting for them to come home. I think about the porch light at the Swanson house in Marshall, Minnesota. I think about what it means to leave a light on for someone who might never walk through the door. It is not rational. It is not practical. It is something deeper than that. It is the refusal to accept that the story is over. It is the insistence that there is still a chapter to be written, even after years of silence, and maybe that is what love looks like when it has nowhere to go. It becomes a light. It becomes a Facebook page that gets updated year after year. It becomes a podcast recorded through tears. It becomes a walk through the woods on a cold weekend morning, searching. The families in tonight's stories did not choose to become public figures. They did not choose to have their grief analyzed by strangers on the internet. They became public because the people they loved went missing. And the only way to keep the search alive was to keep telling the story. That takes a kind of courage that does not get talked about enough. There is also something worth saying about the true crime community itself. The millions of people who follow these cases, who share posts, who analyze evidence, who keep conversations going long after the news cycle has moved on. At its best, that community is a force for good. It has generated tips. It has put pressure on law enforcement agencies to take cases seriously. It has ensured that names like Brandon Swanson and Maura Murray and Brandon Lawson and Amber Tuccaro are not forgotten. but it also carries a responsibility. These are real people. Their families read the forums, they see the speculation, they hear the theories, and every careless comment, every wild accusation, every piece of misinformation that gets shared as fact adds a small weight to the grief they already carry. If you follow cases like these, do it with care, do it with respect. And if you ever find yourself forgetting that the person at the center of the story was real, take a step back. Tonight, wherever you are, I hope you are safe. I hope the people you love are close. And I hope that if your phone rings, you answer it. Because you never know when a voice on the other end is reaching out for the last time. I want to leave you with one more thought. We started tonight with the idea that a phone call should mean safety, that if you can hear someone, you should be able to help them. And we have spent 2 hours sitting with the painful truth that this is not always the case. But I do not want that to be the final word, because those calls, incomplete and agonizing as they were, are also proof of something. They are proof that in the moments when everything was going wrong, these 4 people reached for the people they loved. Brandon Swanson called his parents. Maura emailed her boyfriend. Brandon Lawson called his brother. Amber Tuccaro was on the phone with her brother. In their last moments of connection, they reached for family. They reached for home. They reached for the people who made them feel safe. And that, I think, is the part of these stories that we should carry with us. Not the fear, not the mystery, but the love. The fact that even in the darkest moments, on the loneliest roads, in the most frightening circumstances, people reach for each other. The signal might fail, the call might drop, the distance might be too great, but the reaching, that is the part that is human. That is the part that endures. And maybe that is the closest thing to a lesson that these stories offer. Not a lesson about safety or caution or the dangers of dark roads, though all of those things are real, but a lesson about what matters most when everything else falls away. When the gas runs out and the car is stuck and the darkness closes in, you reach for the people you love. When the road turns unfamiliar and the snow is falling and you are alone, you write an email to the person who makes you feel safe. When you are afraid and bleeding and the brush is closing in around you, you call your brother. When a stranger is driving you somewhere you do not want to go, you stay on the phone with your family because their voices are the only thing anchoring you to the world you want to return to. These 4 people, in their final moments of connection, showed us what matters, and their families, in the years since, have shown us what it means to love someone past the point where hope is reasonable, to keep searching, to keep a light on, to keep telling the story. I want to say one more thing about the families, because I do not think we talk about this enough. The families of missing persons are asked to do something that no one should ever have to do. They are asked to grieve without closure. They are asked to answer the same questions from journalists, from podcasters, from online strangers, year after year. They are asked to relive the worst moment of their lives every time someone discovers their loved one's case for the first time. They are asked to be grateful for the attention while simultaneously being exhausted by it. They carry a weight that does not diminish with time. It simply becomes part of who they are. To the Swanson family, to the Murray family, to the Lawson family, to the Tuccaro family, if any of you ever hear this, I want you to know that these stories were told with care. I hope we honored the people you love. I hope we got the details right. And I hope that someday, somehow, you get the answers you deserve. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for listening with care. These were hard stories to tell, and I imagine they were hard to hear. Take them gently with you and hold the people you love a little closer. Good night.